Okay. Hey guys. Whoa. Okay. Pulling up your questions for today. Getting the timer so I don't go over again. So, again, sampling some of your questions. Voltaire and other philosophers in the Authority of Science chapter presented on 3 critical topics: progress, nature, and freedom. Are these topics still observed today? How would society be better if they were observed more closely? Okay, so let's take these up. Is progress, nature, and freedom still observed today? Well, the answer is of course, they're observed. What I'm wondering is if you're asking, is this still an emphasis or still a strong assumption in the field of psychology? And the answer is very much so. So let's think of the word progress for a minute. Imagine you're in a class and the professor assigns you to write a research paper, and the professor specifies that she will not accept any reference that you have that is older than 5 years, meaning that she will only accept the most recent publications within the psychological literature. When we ask her why is it that you will only accept studies published in the past 5 years? Her answer will be, well, only something along the lines of the most recent data is the most valid data, meaning that the more cutting edge and more up-to-date the research is, the better it is than the previous, which was better than the previous, which was better than the previous. Therefore, there's an assumption of progress there. So that assumption is very much alive and well with us today in the field of psychology, to the point that it blinds us for some of the brilliance of what happens in the research before us, that what is up to date is considered better de facto just because it was published this year. Doesn't matter if the study is or it doesn't matter as much if the study is of very poor quality. So it's latest and greatest, hottest and softest, slickest and best. It's fun for me, although I don't enjoy wood shops, much to my father's and grandfather's dismay. I'm much more of a metal shop kind of guy. It's fun hanging out with my dad in his shop, because he has some pretty nice tools in his shop, pretty laser guided saws and things like that, things I didn't even know would exist. At the same time, though, it's really fun watching the way in which sometimes just a hammer and chisel is really the best piece of technology in the room, and that if you keep trying to use these advanced technologies for something that really a hammer and chisel is better at, you're going to create a lot more work for yourself. And so, likewise, going digitally has created a lot more work for me. You think that this would simplify my life. It's actually greatly complicated my life, and probably yours as well. But the assumption is because technology is new, and these video conferencing and these streaming technologies are new, therefore they're better than us sitting around in my office and having these conversations more organically face to face. I couldn't disagree more. I think the old school is far better in some ways. Now, old school wouldn't help us for streaming. Imagine doing this in an old school conference call where we're all on wired phones and we have to dial in a particular code at a particular time. Oh, I remember those days. This is better in some ways, but not everything is. So, likewise, think of progress in terms of human development. You read a chapter on this, the God is Dead chapter, the Death of God chapter, sorry, that developmental psychologists, by and large, although with some exception, take up adults as somehow profoundly more sophisticated than children, which are profoundly more sophisticated than babies, in a progressive fashion. That's very much a part of that particular line of reasoning, this notion of progress. What we get to do, though, is we get to ask, because in this class we get to think differently. We get to criticize, not just for the sake of criticism, but wonder what we could create new and better. What did you lose as a teenager that you had as a child? Okay? Now that you're an adult, think about what you've lost compared to what you had as a teenager and what you had as a child. Our emphasis has been on gain and the progress thereof, right? That the more I get as I develop, then that's better. That's one of the assumptions of progress, is that new is better. I'd like to put it to you, though, that new isn't necessarily better when it comes to development. So now that I'm working my way well into middle age, I get to think about the fire of my youth, the simplicity and clarity of confidence, of certainty. I've lost all of that. Now, in some ways, that's really good. But if you're calling and asking me to fight on the front lines of a political or ideological or, heaven forbid, combative battle, you very much want the younger me rather than the older me. When I think of the creativity in my childhood, the way in which I was an unending source of art and stories, etc., yeah, I still create a lot of art with words and I still tell a lot of stories. But I've lost that spark of, no, I've not lost it. The spark of creativity is dimmed. But it's still there. I'm still a pretty creative person. Just not like I was. And so, again, I'm not emphasizing right now everything I've gained, but what I'm trying to say is that maybe progress isn't progressive. Maybe that every time we grow, we also lose. When I was an infant, I could put my heels behind my head. Now as an adult, that would dislocate my hips and knees. Like it's not going to happen. We lose things as we gain things. And so wouldn't it be interesting if one of you starts to write a developmental psychology that is progressive and regressive at the same time? Somebody who actually starts researching the ways of thinking and the styles of thinking that we had as a child that were helpful and meaningful, and now we lose them. In fact, what I get to enjoy as a society, we seem to spend so much time trying to regain that which we have lost. On my Instagram feed, for example, I post parables on an Instagram feed, and boy, Instagram has me on lock. It knows I'm middle-aged, and so it shows me a lot of, try this liniment for your hurting joints, and these support socks, and it will cure your life, your back pain. Try this back brace, and oh boy, the advertisers have me on lock. And so, wouldn't it be fun if we start looking at not what babies gain when they become children, but what they lose and what we lose when we move from childhood to adolescence, and what we lose when we move from adolescence to adulthood, and what we lose from early adulthood to middle adulthood to late adulthood to elderly years, right? To focus on the loss. In fact, one of the things that I also chuckle at is there's an old phrase, once a man, twice a child, that as we're little kids, we so want to be grown up and have freedom, etc., and think and, make money and be independent. And then we get that. And then as we get older and older and older, we lose that and we become more and more childlike again, right? And that old riddle has four legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening. And the answer is man, right? 4 legs when we're crawling on our hands and knees, 2 legs when we're walking upright, 3 legs when we need a cane. And so we become more childlike in our elderly years. Right? Trust grandma to say something that makes everybody in the room blush at just the right time, something like a little kid would say. So again, something to put out there. The emphasis on progress is still very much alive and well with us. And I wonder if progress is necessarily good, and what we lose by progressing. So is the topic of nature still alive and well with us in psychology? Oh boy, yes, very, very strongly. In fact, there is an observation that natural phenomena are normally distributed. Okay? To unpack that a little bit. So if we look at natural phenomena like the height of pine trees in a forest up here in these mountains, is the height of pine trees normally distributed? If we were to measure the height of every tree, we would find that there is an average height, and that some trees are really small, most are average, and some are super, and very few are super tall, that there's a nice normal curve. This also applies to height of human beings. My father has a yearbook, a graduation book, if you will, from when he was in the military. And it shows men lined up at basic training by height, from 5 feet, or just under 5 feet, to 7 feet tall. And so it's an aerial photograph taken by helicopter of men lined up. So 5, 5'1", 5'2", 5'3", 5'4", 5'5", all the way up to 7 feet tall. And it follows a nice, neat, normal curve when you look at these lines of men. There's only a couple who are in the 5 feet range, then you get up to about 5'10", and there's this huge line of men who are 5'8", 5'9", 5'10", 5'11", 6 feet, and then it quickly tapers off. So there's only one guy that's 7 feet tall, one guy that's like 6'10". You guys get the picture? That phenomena in nature are natural phenomena in nature are normally distributed. That is such a huge assumption, and not an assumption, but an assertion in the field of psychology. It changes the way we do science in the name of that assumption, particularly in the way in which we perform our statistics. So the statistical methods that you were taught in your statistics course, I'm sure you were taught, rely on the assumption of natural distribution of the phenomenon in question. That it's not just pine tree height or soldier height that's normally distributed. They assume that IQ is normally distributed, or personality attributes are normally distributed. And as they're working on building their IQ tests, if the results on a large sample of research subjects, if it doesn't come out normally distributed, they keep changing the test until finally they get a normally distributed response. Their assumption of normalcy is that strong, that it's just natural, right? Things in nature act this way. That I can remember we were working on a personality test called the Social Connectedness Scale, or the SCS, and this is back in graduate school 100 years ago. And as we're working on it, one of the results we kept getting is that there are a few people who tend to feel very, very connected wherever they go. They tend to feel at and at one with other human beings, even in other cultures and places. They're the kind of person that if they didn't speak German or know anything about German culture and I took them to Germany, they would be very quickly relating to the Germans, trying to figure out how to speak German and trying to relate to them within that cultural frame. If I took them to China or the Congo or wherever else, they would try to not fit in, but they would try to relate. They would try to connect to the people around them. And that there were a few people who were really strongly socially connected, and that it tailed off, right? There's a few people who are really high on the social connectedness scale, and a few are kind of middling in the social connection, and some are just indifferent. They like their cheeseburger and their Walmart and their YouTube videos. They're not really interested in reaching outside of their comfort zone to connect with other people who have different tastes and different cultures and different languages. And so I showed that result to my professor, and he looked gutted, like he looked despondent, like how badly did we screw up when we wrote this test, and now we need to completely rewrite it so it will show, that it will demonstrate the normativity, right, in our sample, that our results should follow the normal curve, because it's just natural. Well, then I started beating my head against the wall. What if all phenomena aren't normally distributed, and what if human phenomena aren't normally distributed? But he wouldn't even credence it. He says, Matt, if this isn't normally distributed, then none of the statistics that we do on this will be valid. So therefore, our results have to be normally distributed in order to do statistics on them. That it's all based on what he called the laws of nature. And the laws of nature is that everything's normally distributed. And I keep thinking, what of all the things in the world that violate the normal distribution? Not everything in nature is normally distributed. Like, I say, you're chatting with my little brother who's an astronomer, and the way in which celestial objects, certain types of celestial objects don't follow a normal curve. The ways in which certain leaves don't follow normal curves, the way certain species of animals don't, their distributions of various attributes don't follow the normal curve. So there's this huge assumption that it's of what nature is, and their assumption of nature isn't actually natural. Just because the vast majority of phenomena demonstrate the normal curve doesn't mean all of them do. And so, but that's a huge assumption. The other thing is, nature has also come to mean material causality or material determinism. So if you remember your four causes, so this is back in our Aristotle, the psychology of Aristotle unit, that you have the material cause, the physical substance of a thing causes the thing, the efficient cause, the process the thing went through space and time makes the thing what it is, the formal cause, the shape of it, the form of it, and then the final cause, the purpose of it, that those four causes together are going on for any one thing. Well, in psychology, we've deleted two of the causes, formal and final. We don't talk about context, and we don't talk about purpose. Instead, we engage in what's called the reductionism, and we've read several chapters that alluded to or directly touched on this idea called reductionism, and therefore determinism, that we reduce our behavior down to nature and nurture phenomena, that we are all just moist robots programmed by our environment. And then in psychology, there's some branches and subfields in psychology where they're doubling down even more, and they're saying, no, it's all just biology. That your personality, your attributes, your attitudes, your behavior, what you wear, who you vote for, all of that is all just biology. And so they're pushing that because nature and the laws of nature, according to this particular philosophy, has certain inviolable and inerrant activities that nature engages in, that nature follows a certain pattern, and therefore you tune into that pattern, you too can be certain about your results. Whether it's a personality test or a neurobiology scan, that if it's nature, then that's certain. Now, as I've mentioned, I'm going to beat this dead horse for a minute, but nature isn't certain. Nature doesn't seem to care about our certainty. Nature throws us a curveball pretty regularly. In fact, nature behaving in unnatural ways, in seemingly unnatural ways, is one of the reasons why we're motivated to do the sciences that we do. Why is it that occasionally it rains orange, right? That seems unnatural. Why is it that, you read these, they seem like Ripley's Believe It or Not, like old wives' tales, but increasingly with the advent of camera phones, they're well documented that, this particular fish started falling out of the sky. Why was it raining fish? These seem like unnatural phenomena, and they're very rare. But there's not a normal distribution of fish rain, right? That seems to happen extremely rarely. It's not like, in this area it never rains fish, and here it rains fish all the time, and over here, it rains super tons of fish, but there's an average amount of fish rain. No, it doesn't seem to happen that way. And so, again, nature seems to play by its own rules. It's very consistent most of the time, but not all the time. Okay, so there's still a strong emphasis on nature. I just read another article just a couple of weeks ago that there's a group of scientists who are now saying that they're trying to flare up the nature and nurture debate again by saying that, okay, we came to a compromise that who you are as a person is a product of your upbringing and your biology, but we're going to fire the first rocket in this new war and say, no, it's all just biology, and they're trying to start that war up again. And when you look at their data, if you don't look at it completely, it seems really compelling, and oh my gosh, they're so right. But again, you start peeling back the layers and looking at their assumptions, etc. It's just as problematic and just as enlightening as any other piece of research. Okay, so nature is still there. Natural is considered good. All natural is considered good. Even when we look at society, even when we look at just go to the grocery store. It's organic, right? What does that mean? All nature, all natural. When nature is good because nature would never make harmful chemicals. Tell that to a biologist, right? Nature's very good at making harmful chemicals. And so I just love that we still have this strong emphasis on nature, and it just shows how blinded we are by our culture, by our social imaginary, right? Our psyches are very much embedded within the social imaginary, where certain words mean certain things, and when we begin to unpack that meaning, we find it is uncertain and it's all philosophy. So you guys have read very carefully in your Robinson text, as well as in the Schleifer and Richardson text, about how uncertain our methods really are and how our results are not as assumption-free as we would like to believe that they are. And so the third one is freedom. Is freedom still an important part of what we believe in psychology today? And that is a solid yes and no. It's shocking, a solid yes and no. And what I mean by that, it depends on the subfield of psychology, okay? So, on the science side of things, when I am looking scientifically at the objects of my science, called research subjects, then the last thing I want them to have is freedom. Because that would imply that they could later choose otherwise than how they chose to behave in my study, which means I could not actually predict or control their behavior, which means my study is bogus, right? It's for naught. So I don't want freedom, and I will tend to philosophize and write about in my psychology articles as human beings as determined things, right? That this gene controls this behavior, or this style of parenting equals this type of adult. That I don't want people to have freedom. I want my science to be certain, and certainty and freedom are enemies, right? If people are free to do whatever they want, the only thing that I'm certain about is that they're free, and I can't predict any other outcomes. So that being said, there's a flip side, and that's therapy. One of the things that various intellectuals and researchers have commented on about psychotherapy as an endeavor here in the United States, as well as much of Western Europe, is that it is a strictly anti-authoritarian, liberationist practice. That psychotherapy tends to radically assume human freedom. In fact, freedom over our own thoughts, freedom over our own behavior, that we can train ourselves to think and behave differently because we're free to do so, and the only thing that's getting in our way is habit. And so, yeah, they do acknowledge, yes, sometimes biology gets in the way, and that's why we have anxiolytics and antidepressants. But even then, you're free to take or not take your pills. And so, if you were to go to a therapist and you're complaining, let's say you're considering leaving your religion of origin, that you're well into your adulthood, you've started revisiting many of the religious lessons of your childhood, and they're not holding water, you really have some very strong doubts about what your religious leaders are saying, and you're thinking about leaving the faith. And imagine going to a therapist, and an American therapist goes, nope, Jesus says you've got to be a member of that faith. Here's the rules. Here's the 10 Commandments. You need to obey those. My homework for you and next week is how to recommit to your faith. A religious leader might say that, but if an American therapist said that, they'd probably lose their license. It is so deeply anti-authoritarian and so deeply liberationist that anything about conforming to authority is often looked upon with askance at best, and can be a doppel complaint at worst, right? A complaint to the Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing. That anything that encourages us to conform to authority in psychotherapy, like I've not seen a single lesson on here's how to do therapy around nonconformists, how to help them conform and become a cog in our capitalist machine. Like I don't see those therapies. Instead, it's about how to have people have their own voice and to be empowered and to make their own choices, and how to live those particular lives of self-responsibility and self-direction, that you are the pilot of your own ship, the master of your own domain. Like that is the strong emphasis. That's why therapists don't read research. Okay, there's a whole bunch of reasons why, but that's one of the reasons why therapists don't read research, right? That the assumptions of the researcher are diametrically opposed to the assumptions of the therapist, and vice versa. That I can sit down and read articles, but if the articles are assuming my clients are determined by nature and nurture, then what kind of therapy can I do, given that I've been telling them to empower themselves and to speak their own voice and to stand up against oppression, that there's no controlling that. I have no say in that. They're just moist robots. Maybe I can offer a little bit of programming, reprogram them a little bit, but really it's about, if I were a researcher and a therapist, it would be about creating better societal cogs, people to live in this machine a little better. And there are systems and styles of therapy that unfold out of that. But that's not how most therapists practice. Most therapists tend to value liberal individualism. Liberal mean not liberal as in liberal versus conservative, but liberalism as in liberated, right? As in free. And individualism meaning that you are only beholden unto yourself, that you are an isolate monad in the world, that you see to your own destiny. You are the only source of your own success and failures, your own happiness and misery. It's all about you, boo. And so therefore you are free to make these successes happen. You're free to be happy, and you should, right? That's liberal individualism. So, freedom is everywhere. Now, how would society be better if these were observed more closely? Okay, I'm going to flip your question on its head and say, how would society be better if maybe we stopped assuming these as goods? How would society be better if we started looking at development as a process of gain and loss? How would society be better if we were interested in what people wrote 100 years ago rather than what was written in the last 5 years? How would society be better if we looked for what worked well? My father and the hammer and chisel, right? The artistry that could be created with very simple tools and a lot of care. Likewise with parenting. What would it be like if, rather than just handing my kid a screen, I had time to go and play with the kid outside? All of this technology was supposed to liberate me to have more time. In fact, you guys, I think that's in the next chapter you're reading, if not the chapter you're reading currently, that there was a really hope that technology would liberate us to be creative, to be philosophical or musical or artistic, and far more relational, to spend more time together. And it turns out, look what technology does instead. It's given us yet another medium by which not to connect. That this is nowhere near as rich as if y'all were sitting around here around this big table and we were, had some nachos and we were chatting about these things together. This is a lot less meaningful or impactful. So maybe we've emphasized progress too much and we've lost touch with what was good. That I may have an iPhone 24X with the 20 billion gigapixel camera, but how deeply connected am I? How is this once again a time sink? Why does I get so little sleep, right? So maybe we should emphasize progress less. Maybe we can begin to look at, as we've progressed, what we've lost. When we moved to Indiana, I was intrigued because there were all of these lovely homes with these spacious front porches, just beautiful. And the majority of those front porches had been walled in and had become just another room, usually a storage room up in the front of the house. And curious, I dug into the history of it. That as televisions became more and more widely available and as internet became more and more widely available, people started relating to technology more than other people. And other people began to be seen as a nuisance or harassment. And so therefore, where people used to sit on their front porch and sip tea or iced tea or lemonade and holler at the neighbors and people walk in the neighborhood, when I would walk those same neighborhoods, half a century later, it wasn't uncommon that people would call the police because it was so rare that somebody was out walking the streets. And it took a few years for my neighbors to get used to me walking. I wasn't walking up their house peering into their window. No, I was just on the sidewalk. But it was so rare where it used to be so common. And I would find pictures in the libraries of my neighborhood. I lived in the 12 Points area of Terre Haute. And people just walking the street all hours of the day, right? Not at night, but all hours of the day. This, especially, before work and after work, people were just communally hanging out there. We've lost that. Now I've gained super mega high fast internet. I can now pwn faces on my video games, which I couldn't do back then. They didn't have internet. But we've also lost something. So, likewise, with nature. What if what is valuable about you isn't just the ways in which you're a biological machine? What if what is also valuable about you is the way in which you transcend the flesh? The way in which you're constantly making yourself, and sometimes in surprising and creative ways. The way in which, unlike nature, which makes us out to be physical objects unto ourselves, what if we are emotional beings together? Although that seems very unnatural, it seems metaphysical. That, yes, there are physical, natural things going on when I think about how fond I am of my beloved. Right now, as busy as she is uploading videos for my other classes. And then as soon as I'm done here, she'll help me upload this one. That those feelings, again, I have bodily things going on. Like I can feel the lump in my throat when I think about how grateful I am for her. That we are emotional beings together. Likewise, one of the reasons I miss y'all's company is even though the class is kind of boring and kind of dry, this is actually ironically one of my favorite classes to teach, although it's the least favorite for students to take, because we get to peel back all of the assumptions in psychology and show the emperor has no clothes. It's still sitting in class with y'all and seeing your bored expressions, sometimes enlightened expressions, the joking back and forth. When I'll say something very controversial and a couple of you will do this, like, wait a damn minute. And it's really fun for me to see those kinds of reactions. So we've gained something. We've gained this medium by which we can still carry on class. But we've lost something, and that is the relationships. Right? It's harder for us to relate. And so I don't get to see y'all's faces. And what percentage of communication is nonverbal? Right? Which means I'm speaking in silence, or speaking to silence. So what if we began to look at us and really delve back into those old school psychologies which didn't take us up as natural objects in the natural world only, although most theories of psychotherapy and psychology have taken us up as such in part. What if what is most valuable about us is the way in which we transcend nature, the way in which we can surprise other people, the way in which it doesn't seem like, although our lives and our habits have certain rhythms and certain patterns which are easily detected, the way in which we can also surprise ourselves and other people. And likewise, freedom. I appreciate the emphasis on freedom. I don't want that to go away. At the same time, though, I would like us, maybe a few of us rebels who come out of classes like this one, to also emphasize obligation. I am free to do whatever I want. What if in psychology we also taught people moral concern of, and please be mindful of how your behavior that you are freely chosen is always already informed by those around you, meaning they're a part of your choices, and the ways in which your behavior affects other people. Too often in my life as a therapist, I get to, although I love meeting with my clients, too often one of the things they report is when parents embrace their freedom at the expense of their children. We had a party at one of the clinics where I was working, and one of the clients came in for group therapy, and he was already in his costume, and his costume was a midnight black morph suit. So a morph suit, if you know, is like a piece of spandex that covers from the top of your head to the bottom of your feet. It just blanks out most of your identifying particular characteristics and just makes you amorphous. And with a pack of Marlboro cigarettes in his hands. And I couldn't figure out that costume for a minute, and then it dawned on me. Right, he's making himself absent in the morph suit, and it was a joke about how when he was 4, his dad left for cigarettes and never came back, right? What happens when a parent puts their individual desires and the freedom that they have to do individually what they want with their individual lives in their own individual time, in their own individual ways, and they do so in a way that is inauthentic to the obligations they have for others? Likewise, an employer, one of the most heartbreaking therapy experiences I had, and I get into this in more detail in the therapy class, is when a client of mine who had already suffered horrific and catastrophic losses, medical bills started coming in when he thought that his wife was fully covered by insurance. Well, it turned out their chief finance officer at the corporation had been embezzling all the money that should have been going into the insurance fund. And right before he got caught, he got on a plane to a non-extradited country. And so he's living there on a beach on other people's and justifies himself. And he did what made him happy. Maybe what we could do is return to obligation, but in a way not to shame people or guilt them, but in a way to help them live up to and live into human relationships more fully. So, would society be better if we emphasize progress, nature, and freedom more? No, I already think we emphasize those aplenty, especially in psychology. What I get to wonder is maybe we've observed them or uphold them or assume them too much, and we can begin to change our assumptions. Okay. So another question. we've talked a lot about the empiricists and their focus on experience. But unless I'm remembering poorly, the book doesn't talk a lot about the methods that the empiricists use to back up their theories. This chapter talks about Wundt and his desire for proper methods and measures. Was his psychology laboratory the first that used specific measurements? Was mathematical psychology really created by Fechner? When did statistical analyses become a part of psychological research? Oh, that is so tasty. Great question. Thank you. So the intellectual history of psychology book doesn't get into method much. You're right. The methods, though, wouldn't surprise you. William Whewell was an historian and philosopher, and if you remember back in the 1800s, he tried to distinguish science, natural science, from natural philosophy. So natural philosophy is what makes a thing, like what makes this plant, this particular plant, and not this other plant, or this plant versus an animal. And that's natural philosophy. And natural philosophy did involve certain methods of measurement and chemical analyses, etc., but it was really about the big picture of wondering what things were for and how they relate. Whereas natural science required a very different method, and that's actually how Whewell separates science, natural science, from natural philosophy. And that is that scientists all follow the same method, and it's the method that you've been taught since you were probably in elementary school. And that is, it starts with observation, meaning observation through our physical senses, not sitting back and engaging in rational analysis and Gedanken, like what Einstein did, where he would just sit back and think thoughts, right? Instead, Whewell's model means you have to start with observation. So I observe that when my pipes are a certain age, that they clog up, and when I look inside the pipe, they are lined with and clogged with white and orange mineral matter that has a particular chemical makeup, right? So that's observation. Then part 2 is hypothesis. Hypothesis is where I field my first best guess about what the thing I'm observing is, or if it's a cause and effect relationship, how A causes B. And so in this case of my pipes, I might wonder about how it is that the minerals in the water might be causing the buildup in my pipes. And so the next is test, and test. So you test it, and if you fail to reject the null hypothesis, nothing is happening, or there is no relationship. Over and over, you keep testing that HO, that the null hypothesis, you test it, nothing, and you fail to reject it, that means something else. There might actually be a cause and effect relationship here, okay? Then that gives you a theory. And a theory isn't just a philosophy or an opinion, right? It's the Facebook level of theories. Well, evolution's just a theory, right? You're misunderstanding the word theory. Theory is an assertion backed up with crap tons of evidence, like lots, decades of evidence, that there is so much evidence, choke a horse with the evidence, right? That's what theory means. So next time a friend or family member uses the term theory in a minimizing or pejorative way, say, well, you need to know what theory means. Like in the literature of science, theory is a big thing. Now, there are some theories that are unavoidable, unviolatable, right? That there are some theories that are just so de facto true that they become physical laws. And those, Well kind of wrote that those were the goals to get to, and that everybody was in the process of that. Now that we've been doing that for 200 years, we have very few natural laws. For example, if you remember reading about Newton in your textbook, Newton came up with the laws of thermodynamics, and those seemed for a very long time to be just universally true, that an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by another force, right? Equal and opposite reactions, various laws of thermodynamics. Those seemed to be the case until we started looking at things at the very, very large macro scale, like the size of solar systems and galaxies, and then at the very, very small micro scale, down into quantum physics, right? And then things started to behave very relativistically, not in a Newtonian fashion. So Whewell establishes that as the method: observation, hypothesis, test, theory, law. And what I get to chuckle at is Whewell was trying to distinguish natural scientists from natural philosophers, but when we look at what scientists do, it's often trial and error rather than as consistent as Whewell pointed out. And natural philosophers also did a lot of trial and error stuff, and the trial and error stuff seems to be very illuminating. And so we can sit and chuckle that Robinson doesn't break down the method when the scientific method is so clear. He doesn't need to break it down in terms of the propaganda, right? How it is that the scientific method is talked about, and scientists do this thing and it makes it science. Well, it turns out that science in a practice is a lot of wild-ass guessing, backed up with a lot of trial and error. Like Edison talked about, he didn't just invent the light bulb, he found 1,000 ways in which light bulbs don't work. And so a lot of trial and error, and that is science, right? So therefore, Robinson doesn't talk about the methods the empiricists use, because hypothetically they all supposedly use the same method, but very few of them actually followed that method. Now, by matter of degree, Wundt tried to. So, if you remember, Wundt set up a psychophysics laboratory, and it seemed to be a lot about the psychology of perception and reaction speed. And he set up his laboratory very carefully. If you're bored, go ahead and Alt and Tab out of this while I'll talk in the background, and Google Wilhelm Wundt's instruments and see the neat little pictures of the dials, etc., that come up, and like one of the images is like of a dashboard of an airplane or something. And that's what Wundt was doing, is he tried to use this very controlled setting, these very controlled stimuli, to measure human perception response time. So, was his psychology laboratory the first one that used specific measurements? Well, in this way, yes. In terms of using technology to measure, as far as I know, Wundt was either the first or one of the first. However, when it comes to consistent observation of human beings, Wundt wasn't the first by any stretch. The ancient Greeks were doing that. They were just doing it in a different way. Likewise, the scholastics and the patristics and the medievals and the Renaissance thinkers, etc., that people have been pretty good at systematic observations. One of the things, though, that we find very consistently, and if this is a common rant of mine, is the consistency of observation often entails certain assumptions going into the observation that then colors the observation we have, that the method supposedly liberates us from. So if I'm using the scientific method, then that makes my observations objective. Okay? So what Wundt was trying to do was use machines to validate his observations, right? It's objective because it's the machines that are doing this, not him. And it was an important effort for those who believe in the difference between objectivity, or even a dichotomous relationship between objectivity and subjectivity. So, yeah. Wundt, if I remember correctly, even called his laboratory a psychophysics laboratory. Like physics is the king mac daddy of all sciences, and so therefore he's trying to make out his laboratory to be a physical laboratory, and trying to make it that ultra sciencey, to try to live up to the scientific prowess of physics. So was mathematical psychology really created by Fechner? As far as I know, I don't have a deep background in mathematical psychology, but what Fechner did, that I think your research methods professors owe a large debt of gratitude to Fechner, was emphasize the use of mathematics in psychology as a way of talking about the validity of our observations. That's where, ultimately, where if we trace the family tree, where p-values or alphas or effect sizes or the correlation coefficient, the analyses of variance, like all of that we can trace back to people like Fechner. So when did statistical analysis become part of psychological research? As long as there have been statistics. So, and it also depends on what you mean by statistics. Like looking at certain medieval studies where just a court scribe just taking notes in the margins about the types of questions that certain types of royals tend to ask and other type of the king, and other types of questions that other royals tend to ask of the king. And just looking at his notes in the margins, he was beginning to count and see typical differences between two different groups of royals and the kinds of demands that they put on the king. And so that is statistical. It's very simple statistics, but it is statistics. If one group asks for one thing 5 times and the other group, given the same size group, asks for the same thing 10 times, and then the first group asks for something